Every good story needs a bit of tragedy. For Hamlet, it was the death of his father. For Ahab, it was the pursuit of Moby Dick. And for Harry Potter, it was when the author just couldn't keep her mouth shut rather than quietly living out the rest of her days in the lap of luxury funded by those endless residuals. Yes, tragedy is at the heart of many great tales, and superheroes are no exception. Case in point, one of the genre's most standout characters, Batman. Yes, the Dark Knight is a character steeped in tragedy, starting with the death of his parents, either when he was 8 or 12 years old depending on the interpretation, and continuing throughout his tenure with stories like Nightfall, The Killing Joke, Hush, and so many more. Though there is one story that, unlike many others, changed not just the character, but the medium of comics forever. This, of course, being A Death in the Family. Yeah, I bet some of you thought I was going to do that thing where I build up to the real answer only to swap it out at the last second with something silly like Zebra Batman. But no, I'm keeping you on your toes this episode.
Okay.
Anyways, A Death in the Family was a pivotal moment for the Caped Crusader. Being the first time ever a Robin had been killed off in mainline continuity, it would leave a lasting scar on the Dark Knight, as well as lead into one of the character's most iconic tales, that being Under the Red Hood. Or Under the Hood as it's officially known. Because since death in comic books is more or less an extended vacation, it was inevitable that the young Master Todd would pick back up the mask and continue the fight. Though this go around he would forego the yellow cape and booty shorts of the past, and instead claim a new mantle. That being the Red Hood. And from here he would transition from being something of an antagonist to the Dark Knight to being a regular ally that you can rely on, while still retaining their rocky relationship, causing the two to come into conflict every now and again. And while that is a whole can of worms all on its own, today I want to answer the question, what made Red Hood such a beloved character? How is it that he transitioned from being the most hated Robin to being at the center of one of the greatest stories the character has ever received? So, let's discuss. Alright, so that friend of mine has been asking me to do a Red Hood discussion ever since I started these semi-coherent rants. First off, I generally like to focus these discussions on things related to the medium of film and television, and maybe video games here and there. I do love comic books, but I can't say it's something I live and breathe nearly as much as film and television. My favorite thing is when you can combine the two together, which is why so many of the discussions follow superhero stories and their adaptations. And while Red Hood has been adapted in the past, and trust me, we'll be getting to that, for a time there wasn't much on the horizon warranting putting a full-on discussion about the character. Until recently when it was announced that DC is going to be producing an animated feature starring both Nightwing and Red Hood, done through this puppet style of animation. And all reports say that the script itself is tremendous, however it is still unclear whether or not it's going to actually be canon. But so long as it's on screen somewhere, that's good enough for me. So this one's dedicated to you, pal. But you better like, comment, and subscribe, alright? I know where you live. And that goes for the rest of you. Anyways, Jason Todd is a fascinating character. First debuting in comics in Batman 357 in March of 1983, Jason was created in order to replace the original Robin, Dick Grayson, after abandoning the role because he felt he outgrown it. Yeah, a lot of stories like to dramatize the whole falling out between Dick Grayson and Batman, but in the initial comic it wasn't really all that deep. Though his post-crisis depiction would see Batman firing his young disciple after being shot by Joker, resulting in Batman fearing for the boy's life. Regardless of how it goes down, Dick Grayson would ultimately take up the role of Nightwing, a mantle in which he carries to this very day. You know, when he's not like a secret agent or a backup Batman. Whatever the reason he leaves, the point is there is a Robin-shaped hole in the Batman mythos, giving space for the second person to pick up the mantle, Jason Todd. Originally being nothing more than a copy of his predecessor, Jason too would come from an acrobatic circus family who themselves were murdered by the criminals of Gotham. Though instead of it being the mob or Tony Zuko or whoever whacked the Graysons, Jason's parents were killed by Killer Croc. And from here, Bruce Wayne would step in as a surrogate father, adopting the boy and allowing him to join him on his crime-fighting crusade as the new Robin. This would eventually be retconned in the reboot Crisis on Infinite Earths, altering Jason Todd's story, so instead of being an acrobat turned Robin, now he was something more of a street urchin living in the slums of Gotham, stealing what he needed to survive. This included money, food, and anything valuable he could get his hands on, including, one night, the tires to the Batmobile. Yeah, those who know anything about comic books would recognize this as the definitive origin for the character, attempting to rob the Dark Knight, only to be foiled in just the nick of time before he's able to lead his iconic chariot on cinder blocks. Batman notices the potential in the young lad, and decides, you know what, if he needs a place to stay, I've got a cave with bats that'll suit him nicely. Now, it was a little more complicated than that, but that's the general gist. His pre-crisis time operating as the Boy Wonder was nothing really all that extraordinary, being very similar to his predecessor, maybe a little bit more reckless. But in post-crisis, Jason was an entirely new entity. Jason Todd was rebellious, aggressive, and far more cutthroat than his predecessor had been. He was hard-headed, stubborn, and had no respect for authority. Which, I mean, come on, Batman. It's not like this particular life is attracting Boy Scouts. But the problem wasn't just his attitude, but also the flippant manner in which he approached Batman's orders. Often charging in head first and not listening to his mentor, Jason would cause more damage and harm to his opponents than even Batman himself deemed necessary. In fact, this boy would even go on to cause the death of one of the criminals he was pursuing. This being one Felipe Garzones. Now, Felipe himself was no saint. Being a serial bad hugger, one of his victims, a girl named Gloria, would unalive herself out of fear of suffering more of Felipe's wrath. And upon discovering this, Jason would pursue the ne'er-do-well and confront them on a rooftop. And by the time Batman himself arrived, Felipe had seemingly fallen to his death. And after asking Jason what had happened, Jason smugly regarded that he must have spooked the guy, causing him to slip and falling into the abyss below, leaving it ambiguous whether or not Jason was telling the truth, or if he gave the guy a little push. And given what the character ultimately becomes, I bet you can guess what actually happened that night. All in all, Jason was not the most stable person to wear the mantle, and this reflected in his fan base. Or rather, the lack thereof, since this crude and violent Robin rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, resulting in the character being killed off in the seminal story, A Death in the Family, where the Joker would use Jason's mother to lure the boy wonder in and beat him to a pulp with a crowbar, only to say sayonara and blow up the building he was in, all with Batman just minutes from the scene. I'm being pretty brief with this story, and that's just because this is the character's second most popular tale, and can't be done justice in a brief overview of the character. Something interesting I do want to touch on though is the fact that this is actually something that was decided by the fans. Yeah, if you can believe it or not, the writers actually put out an offer to their readers to let them decide the fate of this character, giving them two numbers that they could call, and whichever one the fans dialed into more would determine the outcome of the fledgling Robin. And by a slim margin of only about 72 votes, it was decided that Jason Todd was not going to be long for this world. And this is overall just a crazy thing that I can't believe the company actually considered doing. And it's probably something you couldn't pull off now, considering the fact that if they were to do this, my guess is some crazy fan would just flood it with bots. Though that might also have been what happened back in the 80s, considering there's some allegations saying that one of the fans set up a robocaller just to spam them with the number of killed Jason dial-ins. But this is only a rumor and was never actually confirmed. Whatever the case, DC stayed true to their word, and we got the outcome we all know and remember. And the impact this had cannot be understated. Batman would be taken in a darker direction, and audiences would learn that even the characters closest to our protagonist are not safe from death's cold clutches. However, life has a funny way of working things out, which leads us nicely into the character's most famous story, Under the Hood. A story picking up years after Jason had supposedly been killed, but due to the hyper-time shenanigans of Superboy Prime punching reality so hard it created ripples throughout the universe, Jason was somehow resurrected and back to haunt his former mentor. And this story would see Jason doing just that, adopting the mantle of the Red Hood, a persona that previous comics such as The Killing Joke imply was once worn by the clown prince of crime himself, Joker. Anyways, Under the Hood follows a Dark Knight investigating the criminal Black Mask, only to notice that there is something of a shakeup unfolding in the criminal underworld. This is due to Jason making his big comeback, deciding that instead of trying to stop all the crime in Gotham, wouldn't it be more efficient if he were to control it? This puts him on the Batman's radar, along with, bombing the shipping freight he was investigating, allowing the former master and apprentice to learn each other's identities and come to blows with one another, ultimately resulting in Red Hood getting his hands on the man who killed him in the first place, Joker, and forcing Batman to make a choice. And that was whether he would have to kill Joker, or if Batman be willing to do it himself. All in an effort to figure out whether or not Batman cared more about his mission, or the people whose lives have been ruined by his crusade. It's a well-beloved story, so much so that it even received its own animated adaptation in 2010's Batman Under the Red Hood. This is actually where I first found out about this story, and I'm sure many of you out there as well. In fact, this movie was so beloved that moving forward, they would use this story as a baseline for whenever they wanted it retold, tying his story more so of Ra's al Ghul in the League of Assassins, and having his resurrection being facilitated by the Lazarus Pit, and pretty much just ignoring Superboy Prime's involvement in the whole affair. A streamlining I think worked out for the best, and there's a reason why when people think of this story, it's this movie in particular. And the film itself is just an overall masterclass of writing, direction, and animation. I intend on giving this movie a deeper look in due time, but for now I want to focus on the reasons why people have such a fondness for Red Hood, and save his adaptations for another time. Though you might be surprised that in this regard, might not be all that many to look at. Yeah, I always knew that Jason wasn't adapted a great many of times, but it wasn't until this discussion that I realized just how non-existent he was in the alternative Batman media. And it's something I want to dive into a bit more, as well as maybe figure out why writers have such a difficult time bringing this character from the pages to the screen. But unfortunately, that's a bit of a larger topic, worthy of its own discussion altogether. So we'll cover that in a separate video, and finish up the history of Jason Todd here, because this character is part of a ton of different adventures moving forward, but you wouldn't really notice if you only had a cursory knowledge of him. His big two stories are what really define who he is, and do to an extent create a bit of a shadow that the character needs to overcome. But that doesn't change the fact that Red Hood is one of the most interesting characters in Batman's corner of the universe. The position he occupies, both being a former Robin and one of the Dark Knight's greatest failures, makes him compelling enough, but the fact that he doesn't even hold resentment towards the Dark Knight, but instead how he chooses to deal with the maniacs in the city, puts into question not just the man making the decisions, but also the mission itself, and allows writers to dive deeper into what makes Batman so different from the criminals he locks up in Arkham. By challenging the morality in which the Caped Crusader stands, it allows for the character to be torn down only to be built back up stronger, with a greater understanding of why he does what he does. And Jason Todd is one of the ultimate characters facilitating this exploration. And he's also just a fun character in his own right, taking the skills and lessons he learned from his mentor, and applying them in a more violent anti-hero sort of manner. Add on his iconic jacket and helmet, and you have yourself an extremely memorable individual who many fans out there, including my friend, find to be their favorite character in the DC universe. But I don't care what any of you say, this wannabe Batman villain's got nothing on DC's real all-star, Ambush Bug.
This sounds like a job for Ambush Bug!
Anyone out there still remember DC Universe Online, that weird Joker room that he would send you to where you can get a bunch of prizes? Those were the days.